Welcome. I'm Mrinalini Sinha, a professor in the History Department at the University of Michigan and the director of the department's Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies. The Eisenberg Institute is hosting today's roundtable, Policing and Protest 2020, the clamor heard around the world. Before beginning the program, I would like to acknowledge the indigenous communities of our region. The University of Michigan is built on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe people. We acknowledge their contemporary and ancestral ties to this land and their contributions to the university. The unconscionable police killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and many more in the midst of a deadly pandemic and an economic crisis that are disproportionately affecting communities of color have brought this country to a moment of profound reckoning. The police killings unleashed a massive Black-led, multiracial, and multi-generational protest across the United States that has echoed around the world. The groundwork laid down by the movement for Black lives has put on the national agenda some fundamental questions about what the police are for, about how to reimagine public safety beyond the carceral system of jails, prisons, and detention centers, and about the dismantling of institutions and symbols of systemic racism. We are, it could be argued, at a turning point that goes beyond the historical inclination to simply bandage over the problem of anti-Black racism to allow us to imagine the possibilities of deep societal change. As a scholar of colonial India and of the history of European empires, I am struck to find in the midst of these protests the frequent recourse to two Hindi or Hindustani origin words, thugs and looting. These words had once served the British colonial state in India precisely as an alibi for instituting forms of racist colonial policing and a law and order regime that was a cover for theft. As common American words by now, they remind us that this is a history with many layers. They raise the possibility of universalizing or generalizing the experience of racist policing to other places and times, but also draw attention to the specificity of the anti-Black punitive tradition in the US, which deserves its own attention and is the subject of our roundtable today. We have a panel of distinguished experts, scholars of the United States of the University of Michigan, who have thought long and hard about African-American politics, policing, criminal justice, and much more to help us think critically about the present. Let me introduce them alphabetically. Melissa Burch is an anthropologist whose work explores how hierarchies of race, gender, and class are reproduced through processes of criminalization and punishment. She is featured in the 2011 documentary, Visions of Abolition, From Critical Resistance to a New Way of Life. Matthew Countryman, chair of the Department of Afroamerican and African Studies, and a historian who has written extensively on Afro-American politics in the post-civil rights era, including an award-winning book on the struggle for racial justice in Philadelphia. Matthew Lassiter is a steering committee member of the university's Carceral State Project and a historian of suburban politics whose vast scholarly oeuvre brings a combined racial and spatial dimension to understanding structural inequalities and the growth of the carceral state. William Lopez is from the School of Public Health. His work focuses on the health impacts of immigration law enforcement, and he's the author most recently of Separated: Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid, that is about Washtenaw County. Typically at this point, we would give our panelists a traditional Eisenberg welcome with an enthusiastic round of applause. But today, I ask you instead to send them your questions via Zoom Q&A. In fact, let me say a few words about today's format. I have asked each of the speakers to start us off with a few brief initial framing comments. This will be followed by approximately an hour of questions from the floor. So do send us your questions via Zoom and include your name and affiliation so I can acknowledge them. And I will do my best to get to as many questions as I can. Now over to our speakers. We will begin with Matt Lassiter, who will start us off with a historical perspective. Matt, over to you.
Thank you, Minnie. Welcome, everybody. And I'll start by saying that I'm a member of the Documenting Criminalization and Confinement project team of the Carceral State Project. Bill Lopez and Melissa Burch on the panel are also faculty leads, and we have about 55 or 60 faculty, graduate students, undergraduates, and community researchers in this project. And so it's been a really inspiring collaborative project, a public engagement project. We have a lot of community organizations and community researchers we're involved with too. And what I'm going to talk about briefly today is not just my own research findings, but what a team of more than 30 undergraduates and grad students and I came up with, really digging into the question of police violence. So criminalization is a through line of the Carceral State's research project, along with confinement. And we really mean that in the broadest possible way. Criminalization and policing mean the sort of immigration restrictions that Bill's going to talk about and what happens after incarceration, as Melissa, among others, focus on. And the project that we're working on with the policing lab really began after the Michael Brown shooting and Black Lives Matter. And I had taught a lot of classes about racial inequality, about the cities and suburbs and housing and schools. And urban historians in particular, Matthew Countryman and I both come out of an urban history tradition that was very focused on social movements, very interested in how inequality operated in housing markets and in schools, in urban renewal policies. But I think it took historians a long time to really center policing and criminalization as key research questions. And so I'll preface this by saying, I did not start this research project as a police abolitionist, but I am now. And that involves probably, I think, the most important research finding, which is that this is not just a problem of conservative backlash and right-wing, crime control, but that liberal reform is at the center of the cementing of racial inequality in this country. So in the briefest strokes, what we decided to do was try to figure out how many people the Detroit Police Department has killed. That turns out to be impossible. It can never be known. The answer is unknowable. The Detroit Police Department admits to killing 459 people between 1943 and 1979. The only reason we know that is that they put it in a pamphlet very briefly because they were trying to recruit police officers during a time of crisis, and they wanted to let police officers know that they were much more likely to kill somebody than to be killed by a Black Power radical, and that the prosecutor would always exonerate them because the prosecutor always had. And so we started trying to decide how to find the names of people who have been killed. We have identified in my project about 1/3 of the known police homicides. The real number is much higher than the admitted number. And after 1979, there is no data. We do not know how many people the police department killed after that. And the archives are full of deliberate silences of the cases we've identified. The majority are unarmed African-American males who were involved allegedly in property crimes and were fleeing the scene of a low-level property crime. At least that's the story. So shot in the back, fleeing the scene of a low-level crime. And we also tried to document brutality and how that operates. And we found thousands of incidents, but for the most part, people in Detroit, especially African Americans, did not report police brutality because they came to believe that it didn't matter if they filed a complaint, nothing ever happened, and often they were arrested and punished with violence by police for even trying to file a complaint. And so very broadly, we decided to try to document criminalization, police brutality, and police violence. And we've gone from the late 50s through the early 90s so far. And I would just like to list a few of the major research findings of the project, and glad to elaborate. The first is that at all times, a supermajority of white residents of Metro Detroit supported this kind of policing. And I would add a significant minority of African Americans did as well, worried about crime. But there's no question that the white majority broadly supported not just get tough policing, but explicit police violence. And there's a long history of what we call Black Lives Matter activism. There is a long history of mobilizing, demanding civilian control of the police. Why can civilians control their school boards, but the police are untouchable? I don't think a civilian control could eradicate the problem, but it is the kind of liberal left reform that has never really been tried. And then the other findings that we've found, first of all, most of what the police department does not involve crime. It involves criminalization, it's order maintenance. It is creating crime in order to police difference, to police deviance, to protect capital, and especially to defend the color line. Many of the incidents of police violence that we found happen along the color line, and in the 50s and 60s and 70s, that was as African Americans moved out and whites fought and then moved. But by the 70s onward, it also happened along the color line downtown and in Midtown around gentrification and sporting events and that sort of thing. The police department enforced the color line far more than it was interested in fighting crime. Another research finding is that police discretion is deliberate. It's how policy operates, and effectively, even liberal mayoral administrations did not want to penalize police violence because they did not want to take away police discretion to maintain order. So even when the police did something that white liberals were uncomfortable with, like march into a crowd of nonviolent protesters and then just beat kids up, they didn't really want to punish them because they didn't want to set a precedent of putting really restrictions on police power on the street corner. Non-accountability, therefore, is a policy. It was almost impossible. The only 3 times that the prosecutor who are deeply implicated in police violence, the only times the prosecutor said a homicide was not justified was when the cover-up blew up in the faces, and then all white juries acquitted the police officers in those cases anyway. And I would say that violence actually escalated in the 1960s and 70s as civil rights and Black power activism escalated. And the militarization of policing in Detroit and other cities was less about crime control than about crowd control, and especially controlling what they saw as the disorderly public as you started having demonstrations against policing, against civil rights inequality, against the Vietnam War, and the rest. And the last couple of points I would make is the liberal solution to these problems has been, since the 50s and really implemented in the 60s as policy, first, psychological screening and sensitivity training for police officers to try to make individual police officers be less racist. This has been completely ineffective as a policy. Liberals believe the problem is bad apples. They have endorsed community policing, get officers out of their cars and into the corner. And that has just created new avenues of criminalization. And liberals argued for diversifying the force. Have the racial makeup of the police force represent the population as a whole. I think this had a modest short-term effect on extreme police violence in Detroit. But by the 80s, in a majority Black city with a Black political administration, it didn't really change patterns of police homicides and violence and brutality much at all. And that's because liberal reform was completely inadequate to the larger goal of using the police as part of urban governance to fight wars on crime, to fight wars on drugs, to fight wars really on public disorder, to protect downtown property, to protect people coming in to go to sports events and that sort of thing. And policing is intrinsically about power and urban governance and advancing these missions. And historically, the pattern that we've identified is that reforms have failed to do almost anything to stop larger patterns of violence and brutality, because the liberal reformers do not question the larger mission. It is their mission as well.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks very much. And I think a lot of those questions we'll get a chance to explore later. Bill, do you want to get us started?
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. My name is Dr. William Lopez. I go by Bill, and I'm a clinical assistant professor at the University of Michigan School of Public Health. And I'm the author of the book Separated: Family and Community in the Aftermath of an Immigration Raid. And by way of framing my comments, I want to acknowledge a question that I wonder, that I imagine is on your mind. Why is somebody focused on immigration on a panel of policing, on a book focused on the Latino community, and a panel focused on policing in the Black community? So I want to tell you a little bit about how I came to be doing research on policing as well. When I was doing research for this book, so the book follows a few families who were in an apartment that was raided, and this is an apartment in Washtenaw County, a few miles from where we live and a few miles from where you all work at the University of Michigan. And during this time, I spoke with many of the families involved, including those many who were deported. But I also, one of the qualitative components of the project was to ride along with police officers to see how police officers talked about immigration enforcement. One of the things that we find happens all the time, we don't necessarily have ICE and Border Patrol rolling around our streets in Washtenaw County, right? And we talk to police about immigration enforcement. And police will always say, well, we're not detaining people, we're not deporting people. But somehow people in our communities continue to get removed, right? They're not removing themselves. So we know this is a police interaction. So I was doing this work in 2014 and 2015, and I'm sure this audience knows what was happening in 2014 and 15, but briefly, Eric Garner was killed, Michael Brown was killed, Laquan McDonald was killed, followed by Ora Rosser, Tamir Rice, and the growth of the Black Lives Matter movement in parallel. Thus, I was in the position of being a Latino, talking about immigration in police cars exclusively with white officers who talked about policing Black communities. And what they would share with me was a bit unfiltered. And I came to notice that they were sharing these stories with me because they wanted a person of color to side with their police department. And that's how I ended up there and how I ended up hearing these stories. But what I learned there, and what I'll talk about mostly today and how I continued my research, is that the through lines between immigration enforcement and in Latino communities and policing in Black communities, there's so many similarities. And they're rooted in both the same rhetoric, and they're sharing the same material sources to engage in this violence. So policing is often justified using the same rhetoric and mechanisms of immigration enforcement. So this includes both laws and policies and funding and literally the same stuff and the same people, right? So we see this now more than ever, perhaps in our face, as we see Border Patrol drones flying over Minneapolis to take pictures of protesters. We also see DHS agents, Department of Homeland Security agents, in Portland, making protesters disappear into vans, right? So these methods and these materials were perfected in communities of color, and now we're seeing them move out into our larger white and citizen community. And last, I'm in public health. I think of policing as a public health issue and a racial health equity issue. A racial equity issue, not only because the specific instances of violence, which are directly relevant to health, but also because of the sheer number of years of life lost. So police violence accounted for 54,000 years of life lost, and 50% of that was people of color, a larger proportion than they represent in the community. Among the many things that this means is a loss of voting power, a loss of time to collect income, to collect wealth, and therefore difficulty shaping this system as our lives are cut collectively shorter over the population. I want to end just by reminding us that George Floyd was killed by an officer, and after his autopsy, it was found that he recovered from COVID-19. I think among the many takeaway points here, we see that racism and police violence, at least in some communities, is perhaps an even more insipid disease than the worst pandemic we've experienced in the US. So thanks for listening, and thank you, Mina, and I look forward to saying more.
Thanks for those wonderful comments, Bill. Matthew. Matthew, you're muted.
Yeah, sorry. Sorry about that, everybody. I'll probably do that at least 2 more times. So thank you so much, Minnie, and thank you to my fellow panelists. It's really exciting to be here with all of you. Let me just say a couple words of introduction about my own work, and then about the events of the last few months that I've been thinking about a fair amount. It's true, as Matt said, that those of us who've been thinking about African-American social movements in the 20th century have tended to discuss issues of police brutality, what was often called police-community relations, as one of the issues that the Black protest movement was grappling with, but have tended never to quite center on it. And that is remarkable, I think, given just how constant it is within the story, right? Whether you're talking about the pre-Montgomery bus boycott work, whether it's Scottsboro or the work of Rosa Parks and her husband, or a set of issues, the police are always part of the story, and the way in which they operate, right? Obviously, the confluence in the South of the police with the KKK often being one and the same people, for example. And yet we've never really talked, or never is probably too strong a word, but too often the literature doesn't really focus on police as a central question. And in my own study of Philadelphia, right, mass meetings about police brutality are a constant presence as early as the early 1950s. Again, it's never necessarily the main issue, but it's also always there as one of the issues that Black activists are grappling with and dealing with. And I would just suggest that there's a kind of also an evolution here that I think is pretty similar to what Matt laid out in terms of what the kind of demands have been for Black protest activists. And I wanted to sort of, I guess, to contextualize the current issue debates and conversation about issues like defunding and abolition in that progression. Either and the reason I do that is because whether as discursive terms or as policy demands, they don't appear earlier. And that's sort of an interesting question. Why is it that why now are these the demands if this has always been an issue, right? And how does that work in what's going on? And I don't have an answer to that except to suggest a kind of progression. From demands to desegregate the police, to hire Black police officers, which were very, in Detroit and New York City in the 30s and 40s, first begin to emerge. Second, in the 1960s is the idea of community control, right? To sort of moving past the idea of just getting our folks in the police force making a difference. Now we want to shift control over how policing operates, and really to focus on Black communities. And this, in the response to the Panthers' description of the police as an occupying force was the idea that there ought to be Black institutions, Black communities that have control over the policing within their boundaries. And in many ways, I would see the kind of evolution of Black political power in the city in the follow-up to the Black Power movement as exerting a form of community control, which was political control, the idea of electing Black officials, and the presumption, which I think proved actually quite wrong, and we can talk about why, that if you had Black elected officials and you also were maintaining the commitment to hiring Black police officers and even putting Black police officers in management, that this would solve the problem. And to me, that progression is what leads us, I think, to these questions about defunding and abolition, and is worth paying some attention to. Finally, I wanted just to say, and I'm going to be very conscious of time here, just a couple words about the recent events, right? And I wrote in an article, which some of you may have seen, but which starts from the premise of surprise, my own surprise, right? How unexpected this moment we're in now is since the murder of George Floyd. And really, I would think, and we'll look back historically and look at particularly Ahmaud Arbery's event, his killing, as a kind of beginnings of that uprising, and how. But even in the midst of all of that, even though those of us, and myself included, were posting our running times and things like that in support of Arbery, we still didn't expect, right? I certainly was quite surprised by those events. In my own writing, I referred to Vincent Harding, a groundbreaking Afro-American historian's metaphor of the Black movement tradition as this movement from something that was sometimes powerful, tumultuous, roiling with life, and at other times meandering and turgid, right? This idea that there's a movement back and forth, and that we have to sort of take account for that. And that shapes a lot of my thinking about trying to understand why is this surprising? In other words, to recognize that the spontaneity, in that sense, what appears to be spontaneous in the reaction to George Floyd, much like what appeared to be spontaneous in the sit-in movement in 1960, right, is a failure to see the ways in which how movements actually develop and how the development takes place. And here I think we have to really begin to think about Black Lives Matter as an ongoing social movement, right, that has gone through different periods. One I think, an initial period that's rooted in part in the both rising expectations of a Black presidency, but also the disappointment at the lack of change it makes, and beginning to move outside the political system to search for change through social movements, precisely because the political system seems unprepared and unable to solve these self-evident social inequities. Secondly, the kind of retreat following the election of our white nationalist president now, again, fairly common in social movements, that they thrive when there's a relative ally in political power, and they really struggle in the face of determined opposition. And then thirdly, the pandemic, obviously, context, the revelation of both total incompetence at the top, but also the growing grappling with just how unpopular presidency has become for the majority of the population, but also the economic crisis, an economic crisis that is both in the moment, but also, I think, revealing, right, of these deeper inequities in our economic system. Bill just referenced that in terms of George Floyd's own experience, the disparities of health around the pandemic, but also this broader sense that, in fact, we have an economic system that claims one thing, but in fact delivers something very different to the vast majority of our population. And I think that structures all this too, and I'm happy to talk more about all of that.
Thanks. Thank you, Matthew. And there's some already connections that I hope we can get a chance to pick up on, and especially the surprising discovery of the belatedness of scholarship to catch up on the significance of police brutality, and then the connection that Bill was raising between immigration and the criminalization of immigration and criminal justice and mass incarceration more broadly. I just want to remind people that our second half is going to be mainly Q&A, questions from the floor. So please do send us your questions on Q&A and Zoom Q&A, and I will pick up on those questions. So our last speaker, Melissa Burch, certainly not the least. Go ahead, Melissa.
Thank you, Minnie, and thanks so much for the invitation. I really appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion with two esteemed historians and also a fellow ethnographer. So I study the ways that criminal records operate as a mechanism of extended racialized containment. And as I'm sure this audience is aware, people who have criminal convictions face innumerable consequences, including reduced access to housing and employment, but also ineligibility for government support, disenfranchisement, loss of parental rights, and of course for non-citizens, detention and deportation. And I focus in particular on people who have felony convictions for whom the consequences are most severe, which as of 2010 accounted for approximately 8% of all US adults and 33% of the African-American male population. Criminal background screening and exclusion on the basis of criminal records has become more and more prevalent in the last 50 years, particularly in the realms of employment and rental housing, but also, as we know, in everything from college admissions to volunteering, right? And I see this rise of criminal background screening as kind of one of the quieter threads in the very dramatic overall story of expansion in the use of techniques of surveillance and containment that we've witnessed in the US since the 1970s. And so I say all of that to say that, of course, while we've framed our discussion today in terms of policing and protesting, I am hoping we can talk expansively, as Matt already indicated, about policing as part of a wider system of criminalizing practices and institutions that extends all the way from surveillance to the many ways that people are monitored, tracked, and controlled after conviction, and that's regardless whether or not they've spent time in prison. I'm also hoping we can talk expansively about the current protest moment as part of a long arc of anti-racist and anti-punishment organizing. I came to my research focus through organizing in the late 1990s when I became active in the social movement to end what we were then calling, and some of us still call, the prison industrial complex. Although this concept has since been deployed in some reductive ways, usually used to just describe the exploitative use of prisoner labor or profits made by private prison companies, those who coined the term did so in order to describe and analyze the wide range of overlapping investments of government and private sectors in expanding the use of surveillance, policing, and imprisonment. And the term was meant to begin to disrupt the idea that these techniques are a response to crime, right? And I just want to insert this term, prison industrial complex, kind of early in our discussion, in order also to ward off the sometimes tendency to kind of talk about imprisonment or talk about policing as if they're isolated topics. It's interesting to me that although now there's plenty of discussion, obviously, about policing, you know, in the late 90s and early 2000, and really even up until very recently, kind of as awareness has grown about the problem of mass incarceration, as it's been called, there's often sort of lacked an analysis of policing as a key part of the rise of imprisonment, right? And even the term prison industrial complex has often kind of just been reduced to prisons and the politics of prison industrial complex abolition to prison abolition, right? So there's this reducing and this compartmentalizing that I'm hoping we can kind of undo as we talk about these things. And then finally, in raising the concept prison industrial complex, I'm also flagging the late 90s. And in particular, the founding Conference of Critical Resistance that introduced and began to develop this concept of the prison industrial complex and PIC abolition. I think, you know, mainstream media definitely tends to talk about the conditions for new possibilities as if they are created only by the massive protests in response to recent incidences of police violence. But of course, the current conjuncture is rooted in decades and decades of organizing, which, as we'll talk about, you know, goes as far back as we want to go, but in certain ways, for me, begins kind of in the late 90s when people sort of announce this problem and begin to analyze it and actively come together to confront it.
Thank you, Melissa. No, that's great. And, you know, that's exactly where I was hoping we would go, to kind of think about carcerality much broader than just the physical institution of the police. So we have questions coming in, and we have one question that I'm going to piggyback on. It's a question from Keanu. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right, PhD student in our department here in history, Keanu Hydri. And the question is directed at Matt Lassiter, but I think it opens up a lot of other issues as well. And it's basically that how do we begin to think through the dominant liberal narratives of the added value of policing in communities that transcend both superficial identity politics and class reductionism. And I guess what I would add to that question is something that you mentioned, is the recognition of this massive bipartisan support for the police, expansion of the police, and for the carceral state. And I'm wondering if you could help us understand where that bipartisan support comes from, especially at a moment like now, when we have, evidence to show that police reforms have not been the solution. Often they have led to the problem, but despite that, this insistence or this return to procedural reform, a remedy that has repeatedly failed. So that's a question about police reforms. We also have a question about models for successful policing practices in diverse urban environments that Jermaine Jordan has raised, and wants to know if you can think of other places of successful policing practices that might work. And to that, I would add on the question of abolition, the term that Matt first used, but all of you and Melissa used come from that background early on. I want to just raise the term, the invocation of the term abolition at this particular moment. It has an incredibly resonant history, of course, in the history of the United States. And when Du Bois was coining the term abolition democracy, his point was precisely to make slave emancipation a sort of prerequisite for fulfillment of American democracy as a whole. And so when activists now are talking about abolition of police, abolition of prison, abolition of ICE, the US Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, what is the work that that word is still doing? Does it carry, beyond the negative connotations of just ending certain institutions? And I think that's also the thrust, perhaps, of Jermaine's question. So we have a question about policing and the bipartisan support for policing and the policing in different kinds of communities. We have a question about thinking about abolition and what that term might mean. Are there better practices of policing, or is abolition kind of aiming at something much more than just let's improve practices of policing? Maybe a third question I'll tag on to this, and that is a question that kind of interests me in particular about the working of US federalism here. So, with local control over the police and the complete decentralization of police agencies, and somewhere I read that there are about 18,000 separate police agencies in this country. And it would seem that it'd be really hard to imagine any kind of comprehensive change in policing. And when the Minneapolis City Council, after the death of George Floyd, questioned the nature of its relationship with the police, it was a really encouraging sign. But then we have in Louisville, where the city's contract with the police union has made it really difficult to get justice for Breonna Taylor. In Ann Arbor, where we now have a Black Lives Matter flag outside the city hall, there still has been no real accountability for the police killing of Ora Rosser. So does this mean that change has to be very local? But what can be done at the federal level? And what is the history of that interplay between the federal and local levels? How has that played out historically to produce this kind of carceral state that we have? So that's our third question. And these are lots of questions, so I'm going to just stick with 3. Maybe we can get 4 in at the next time. So abolition, policing, federalism.
You want me to start?
Yes, Matt, you want to start?
Okay, those were 3 giant questions that kind of go in different directions, so I'm not going to try to answer them all. I would say to the first question about bipartisan consensus, this may be obvious to a lot of people here, but I feel like the way that we talk about politics and the way that we talk about ideology don't map onto one another. And we talk about liberalism and conservatism as if those are the two sides of the binary that we live in, because when you vote Republican or Democrat. But when we talk about an ideological spectrum, the liberal position is far closer to the conservative position on every issue that we're talking about than either are to the left position that Melissa, for example, is talking about, coming out of critical resistance, radical prison organizing in the 60s and 70s, the Black Panther Party or Black Power critique. And so on so many issues, the book I'm finishing up about the war on drugs, for example, the argument I make about the war on drugs, you take drugs out of policing, you're taking, a third of the rationale right there. That the Joe Biden position that nonviolent drug users should be forced into rehabilitation and the traffickers should be incarcerated is so far away from the civil libertarian position that the government should not be arresting anybody for what is really should be completely a public health. And I don't mean the public health of liberals who believe that you arrest and then divert people into treatment. I mean that keep the police out of this completely. And that left position, legalize, decriminalize all drugs, that's so far away from the mainstream Democratic Party. And there's so little daylight, if there's any at all, between the Democrats and the Republicans on this issue. You could go down a number of other issues like this. And so what I like to say when we think about policing and a radical critique is the Democratic Party is not the basis of the radical critique of how institutions of racial capitalism and power operate in our country. That's a left tradition that is a critique of mainstream liberalism and conservatism. And so I approach the question as an urban historian and a scholar of public policy. I'm more interested in policy outcomes than whether the politician who tried to implement them said they had liberal aspirations or conservative aspirations. Like, what is the outcome of this policy? And this, once you start looking at it that way, you're telling a story of the Joe Bidens and the Charles Rangel, longtime Harlem representative who drove the war on drugs forward. In some cases, they drove it forward harder than the Republicans did because they cared more about people in urban areas they saw as addicts than Republicans did. But they're still in the same, they're still under the, I'm glad for Melissa to say this better than me, but if you're still operating under the umbrella of criminalization, you're pretty close together ideologically, whether or not you're in a different party or a different ballot position. That's how I would answer the big question.
Thanks, Matt. Melissa, did you want to kind of address any one of those issues? Abolition, its broader meaning, or?
Well, maybe we could just dwell for another minute in the question of liberal reform,
okay.
Since that's so juicy. I don't know if this refrain, this phrase has now become fairly popular and repeated often. I don't know if folks have heard it. An abolitionist saying the system is not broken, but rather working exactly as it was designed to work, right? So that phrase was originally coined by the anti-prison industrial complex organizer Rachel Herzing, but it now just sort of gets repeated by everyone, which is great. But I've been thinking lately about how we might kind of extend that idea to the problem of reform. In other words, maybe maybe it's not so much that reforms have failed, right? But rather that they succeed in doing exactly what they're meant to do, which is to improve the system just enough so that it becomes more palpable, more acceptable, and thereby restore the legitimacy of the system, right? And as Matt was talking, I was thinking about one of the most contested struggles that I remember from my organizing days in California that unfolded in 2005 when liberal reformers supported a plan to build 4,500 new prison beds for women prisoners under the guise of sort of kinder, gentler prison cells for women. They called them gender responsive prisons. This was a massive prison expansion plan that would have resulted in not only more women in prison, but also more men who could then fill the beds that they had been filling. Mm-hmm. And yet proponents insisted on calling it prison reform, right? And I think it's precisely kind of in this refusal to acknowledge and own what is the purpose and the logic of many reforms that kind of generates this confusion that we then all live in.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful, thank you. Matthew, do you want to go next?
Sure, if I could keep straight all the things I want to say. I mean, let me just make two points. One is more kind of, I don't know, it's more about a kind of reaction to the moment. And then the second one is to dig somewhat into the federalism issue that many raised. So my reaction simply about the issue of abolition versus the more reform and the ways in which reform speaks to a kind of consensus is to say, I think it's actually quite remarkable the level of skepticism and the level of support for reform and defunding we're seeing, particularly in Black communities at this moment. If we look at this history and look at the urban history of Black responses to police activity. So yes, I think there is a distinct liberal tradition around police reform in the broadest of sense, which is to link police reform to other forms of social welfare reform and to imagine, or at least want to imagine, a solution that combines efforts to address poverty and those kinds of things to notions of security around a reformed police force. I think that's failed quite profoundly. And I think that failure has really shaped so much of the politics of this moment. But we can see in sort of certain kinds of Black community organizing that I wouldn't define as radical, certainly not radical, but certainly as at the progressive end of the American political screen, calls for linking police reform to a whole range of social welfare reforms that were right. And the irony of that moment in the late 90s and the neoliberal era, right, is that you get the police stuff and you don't get anything else, right? And so I think it's worth at least acknowledging the desire for a distinction between liberal and conservative police reform, even when that actually breaks down both politically because of the nature of the American political process, but even more importantly in practice because of the nature of policing and the fact that police reform has repeatedly failed. And that's actually what leads me to the second point about federalism and this sort of multiplicity of police forces, particularly, and this is, I think, worth paying attention to because, of course, because in so many college town spaces, you have this additional form of policing, which is the campus policing, right? And so you have not only multiple units, but overlapping units in the way in which policing gets played out. And I just want to point to sort of two things that I think do structure policing that overrides all these distinctions, right? And one is professionalization, right? The notion that police you have to have certain things to be police, and that one of those things is a gun. Another thing is the ability to arrest people and put them into the carceral state, right? There's all these, which we define as security, as if there aren't other ways in which security could be operating, and that's linked to professionalization. But then it's also clearly linked to unionization and the role of police unions, not only within their own jurisdictions, but more broadly as defining the terminologies of how the police operate, right? The repeated complaints of management that they can in fact discipline rotten apples or whatever they want to call them because of police unions actually exposes the ways in which unionization and its ties to liberalism, right, in the late 20th century were used by very conservative policing forces, I would argue, not even to prevent discipline, but more broadly to define what is policing across all of these categories. I've been known to say kind of outrageous things about police unions and their relationship to anti-democratic forces, but I think more instrumentally, it's the point that they have defined what is the culture of policing its militarization, its sort of male bravado, but also its whiteness, right? As well as terms of how police operate in communities. And this is where it comes back to a certain kind of liberalism. And this is where certainly we see this in Ann Arbor, but in lots of places where middle-class communities, whichever side of the liberal conservative line, have accepted a certain kind of policing in other spaces, right? So long as there's that class and race differential in the way policing happens, right? So that, you know, drunk teenagers in middle-class communities get treated one way. I mean, this is the work that Matt Lassiter has done. Other people in other communities get treated very differently. And that kind of consensus about that does cross all these ideological boundaries.
Wonderful. Bill, do you want to close out this round with any comments? Yeah.
Sure. I want to go back to something that Melissa and Matt mentioned, that for often Democrats and folks on the left, there's this willingness to criminalize and perhaps suggest different things that happen after one is arrested, but there's still this criminalization. And as Matt said, criminalization is fundamental to the carceral process. But I also want to link it a little bit to back to health and back to race. So criminalization largely functions by leveraging these racial tropes often created at the federal or state level. And we see many examples of this. Mina, you opened by saying the word thug and looting, right? Those have clear racial connotations. After an MSU or U of M for that matter game in which our mostly white students are all in the crowd and the car gets broken and burned, nobody's looting, nobody's rioting, people are celebrating, right? So looting means something very specific. I was in Houston when Hurricane Katrina was happening. I saw much of this same rhetoric being played out. Specifically, the war on drugs, our criminalization is racialized, but I also call our attention to the war on terror, right? Where we see this trope of both the narcotraficante, the Latino or the Mexican who is selling drugs, but also the terrorist, who's the Muslim or the Arab, who's engaging in whatever this crime supposedly is. And the second thing is to bring this back to health outcomes, to violence specifically, is the gap between criminalization of any kind and violence is often really, really small, right? And what I mean by that, as Matthew said, when our police force is highly militarized, especially following the war on drugs, everyone is highly militarized. We have weapons, we have tanks, you know, in the case that I looked at, which the raid was conducted by SWAT officers. They had gas, they had rifles, etc. The saying is, when all you have is a hammer, every problem is a nail. When all you have is a highly militarized police force, then even minor crimes are seen as solvable with violence, right? So all that to say is that the gap between criminalization, so criminalization is deeply tied to our racial tropes and is closely connected with the violence that ensues.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I mean, those were a wonderful set of comments that I want to pick up on, but let me get to some of the questions we've been receiving. So we have a question from Brooke Christians, an undergraduate history and secondary education major. And she's raising a question that I think some of you have touched upon a little in thinking about what does it mean at the current moment that people who are talking about the abolition of police are also calling for Breonna Taylor's killers to be arrested. And I think that raises an important question about, and it was something that I was thinking about that the late, great Grace Lee Boggs would often talk about in distinguishing what she called protest organizing and visionary organizing. And the latter was actually to imagine the alternative you want to see. So what are the people who are asking for abolition of police? What is the alternative form of justice, the more redistributive idea of justice than this criminalization they want to see, where Breonna Taylor's killers might not necessarily be criminalized in a certain way, but are there other ways of being accountable? So that's one question, again, about the sort of broader understanding of criminalization and carcerality that we may want to think about. We have another question from Salem Elseway, who's a PhD candidate in the history department. And he's asking about the role of business communities and of property owners, of corporate elites in kind of shaping the relationship between the citizens and the police? And I think that's a really terrific question as well. And I want to add on to that a question that I've been thinking about after I read this op-ed by Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor about the end of politics. And she's referring to the end of a certain kind of phase of Black electoral politics that starts out in the 1970s and, according to her, ends in Baltimore in 2015 during the protests when, you know, all the top leaders of the city were Black elected officials. And my question is, what happened to that pivot from protest to politics that, Matthew, you talk about, echoing Bayard Rustin there? What happened to that? Why did it fail to deliver? And why is it that so many of the Black elected mayors, the pioneering mayors of that time, actually ended up getting embroiled in problems around police? And I think this is perhaps, I mean, Selim's question might be getting into the question of the financial resources of the city and the mayors and that kind of understanding of Black politics. So we have a question about abolition thought about more broadly, like what is the alternative to this asking for more criminalization, more carcerality for every wrong that we see? How can we imagine justice in a more, in a different way? And I think we are seeing some of that. And Melissa, the organization that you've been working on, the New Way of Life, Susan Burton's, I think that offers one kind of possibility. There are ways in which the Freedom Square in Chicago and the Abolition Park in New York are all kind of models of that. But I wonder if one of you would talk about it. And then the question of the economics of neoliberalism and political control that mayors have over police forces and what the police does. So let's stick with two questions here. Who wants to take that first? Matthew.
I can start, yes. Actually, so let me, so the question about Black governance of the city, obviously something, well, not obviously, something I've been working on and have a book that will eventually sort of try to think about these. And I won't try to go on, but let me just say two things about Black political control or Black political power and its relationship to policing in cities. And, you know, part of this is to think about a very traumatic moment in the history of Philadelphia, which was the bombing of Move, the radical group in 1985, carried out, you know, with a Black mayor, oversight over a you know, historically continually racist police department, and you know, and there's been a lot of discussion of this and a lot of dilemma about it. To me, it points, you know, sort of at minimum, right, to the ways in which the structures of racial policing, right, are impervious, in fact, to certain kinds of political power. You know, I think there's some dispute about this, but my sense is there's pretty good evidence that the mayor was mostly isolated from the decision making that led to the actual bombing of in fact, his own base, right, his own neighborhood that he had built his political career out of. But to me, that's as much damning of the political project to turn to Black politics, particularly in cities, as any involvement he might have had. And it you know, it speaks to a kind of larger problem of the Black electoral tradition that I think Keeanga was pointing to, which is the ways in which it was unable to sustain a social transformation agenda. It was very much unable to sustain the commitment that the social movements that birthed it were to racial equity, and became simply a representational process. That in the context of the rightward turn in American politics and the market-based neoliberal idea of city governance, basically without that agenda as a counter to that, essentially became, you know, in a kind of neo-colonial standpoint, implementers of that form of governance. I could say a lot more, but you know, I'll stop there. So.
Bill, did you want to jump in?
Sure, I'll leave most of the answer to the historians. But, you know, briefly, one of the things that I notice is I've spent a lot of time in abolish ICE circles.
Huh.
And recently we see this abolish police circles. And the difference between the reaction when you say abolish ICE and abolish police is astounding, right? And generally speaking, the reason everyone gets on board immediately with abolish ICE is because we know ICE's fundamental function, which is to take people out of their homes and to remove them from the country, right? That is what they do. Now, no matter if you believe they should or shouldn't, we know that the outcome is terrible for these folks in these communities. Now, when you say abolish police, there's an entirely different reaction. And it's often from people who think the police have this peacekeeping, or as Minnie, as you said in the beginning, this role to maintain order, right? And I want us to think about that difference. So we all recognize ICE as the people who are separating folks, and we say abolish ICE. And that's how many people in communities of color legitimately view the police. These police are the people who are patrolling, oppressing, and killing us. So abolish ICE comes as a natural response to this, right? So when we aren't willing to say abolish police, I think it speaks to what we consider their dominant role. And then the second is this, you said visionary and imaginary, right? So imagining this future. This was one of the light bulb moments that I experienced as an advocate working in immigration circles and policing circles as well. Is that we need to be willing and able and brave enough to imagine something that we have no reason to be able to envision, right? So we're creating a world that we want to see, often based not on the world we are currently seeing. And one thing that I find helpful is it took centuries to create this racist policing structure and to set its roots deeply into our country's history. So it may take more than a panel or two panels or a couple of classes to come to a conclusion about what the alternatives to policing are. And that was really hard for me to get, right? I understand, and especially I'm a mixed methodologist, so the surveyist in me wanted the answer. Okay, if we take away the police, what's gonna happen?
Right.
But I learned that no, it's going to take organizing and collaboration and discussion and a bit of bravery and creativity to understand what our other options are. And although we don't have the bullet plan for those options, it's okay to support them as we're moving toward envisioning and creating them.
Thanks. Matt, did you want to jump in?
I'll let Melissa go first. Unless you want me to go. I went first last time.
Melissa.
I'll respond to Brooke's question, I guess, about that it's interesting, and that was the question, to remind everyone about the sort of irony or the contradiction between the same people calling for the abolition of police while also calling for police themselves to be arrested. I mean, a sort of, I don't want to say a true abolitionist framework. I'm not sure, another word is not coming to mind right now, but I just want to say those actually aren't the same people, or they shouldn't be the same people. And to the extent that they maybe are the same people, it may have to do with, I mean, just the incredible uptick in the use and circulation of this term abolition in the general public. And so, you know, there's been, when we first started using that term, it was not popular. It was very radical, very marginal. And now it seems to be just freely floating around in the mainstream media, and everywhere you turn, everyone's an abolitionist. And that's fantastic. And there are some dangers with that we kind of lose what it was meant to communicate. So I guess I'll just say briefly sort of what I mean, or, you know, when I say an abolitionist framework, and that's one that actually calls into question the very idea that police and prisons provide safety, right? And in fact begins from the idea that these systems actually produce more harm than protection, that they are in themselves a threat to security and well-being, right? And so an abolitionist framework proposes two things. I mean, one is kind of this long-term vision of society that prioritizes health and well-being, and thus dramatically reduces the kinds of conflicts that lead to interpersonal harm, right? Which is the kind of crime with which most of us are most concerned, right? And at the same time, it's a practical organizing strategy that insists that the only way we get to this sort of new way of relating to one another is through taking concrete steps to shrink the system, right? To reduce the reliance and the use of all of these things, of prosecutors, of border guards, of police, of prisons. So, I mean, in my work, for example, just to kind of concretize this, it's the difference between saying a person's criminal record should be considered more generously in the employment process, you know, that we should lean more towards second chances, which would be sort of a liberal view, versus calling into question the very idea that criminal records in fact accurately reflect who has done what, right? And so to take that to the defund demand, you know, although that demand has been gutted and watered down and interpreted in a range of ways, the abolitionist version of a defund demand goes beyond sort of tinkering to actually question the idea that police produce safety. So it's not just kind of a numbers game of shifting emphasis within police budgets, you know, to police community partnerships or programs like the foster care system or coercive mental health systems or drug treatment programs, or from one police institution to another, right? It's about taking actual chunks out of those punitive systems and putting them into things that we know contribute to people's health and well-being.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I think that's what we have an anonymous question about abolition was raising, that, you know, in some ways, abolition of police works only with thinking about the other institutions in which you would want to invest. So this is not, the question of defund is not an austerity question, but it is demanding more public goods for people that will prevent that. Matt, I'm sorry, this round we forgot to get to you. You want to jump in?
I just wanted to let Melissa go first because I knew she would answer that question more eloquently than I could. I like Brooke's question, and you know, one of the things that I try to do in my undergraduate class is we take on, especially toward the end, like the really difficult questions like Polly Klaas kidnapped from her home, murdered violently by a recidivist, you know, somebody who'd been incarcerated a lot. And you can tell the story like, well, what do we do about those? Or shouldn't Donald Trump be incarcerated, or the police officer who kills? And you can't, first, you know, you can't formulate, it's a bad idea. We do it all the time. I won't say you can't, we always do. But you shouldn't formulate public policy based on like the worst case scenario. And beyond that, like one thing we uncovered in our Detroit project is that repeatedly the rhetoric is about stranger violence, and most violence is intimate. It's within the family, it's people. Even at the height of the so-called crime spike in the late 60s, early 70s, 70% of all homicides in Detroit were within the family or people who knew one another. And the man who kidnapped and killed Polly Klaas had been in and out of institutions since he was 14, 15 years old, and like grew up in a violent society. And we solve problems in this country with violence. This is why Bill's project is so essential to our mass incarceration project. Some of the best work on policing coming out among scholars is about policing the empire and how that kind of reverberates back. The United States is an extreme, but definitely most countries also have racialized systems of control. This is how we regulate and control labor in a capitalist system. It's how we regulate and control order in space. It's how policing of difference by race and gender and sexuality and class and citizenship has happened for a very, very long time. We have radically unequal social welfare system, and so we pick up the pieces with the criminal justice system. I mean, Matthew Countryman is talking about like the quandary of Black mayors. We found documents from the late 80s where Coleman Young, the African mayor of Detroit, is negotiating with the governor to incarcerate 1,000 Black male juveniles in adult prisons to solve the city's crime problem. And it seems incredibly punitive he's also operating in a context of like the jobs have disappeared. He has very little ability to bring capital into the city when he can. It's all downtown, and they just pump policing in. Like, this goes to Salem's question even more, to protect downtown capital. And so it's, the more you dig in, the more we're talking about questions that go to the heart of how we've organized the political economy, how we police difference, how we have a system that requires low-wage labor to sustain affluent lifestyles, but doesn't want to acknowledge that, and so has to criminalize that labor to control it. That we don't have adequate, we don't have a universal healthcare system. We don't have adequate public health and mental health, so we incarcerate people in jails and deal with the consequences. And that's the bigger question, in which the smaller ones, like, well, what do we do about the violent sexual assault problem, and shouldn't we incarcerate those people? But a more holistic approach kind of goes after, like Melissa and Bill and others were saying, the big questions.
Right. Actually, that segues nicely with that. I think we have.
Can I just say one more thing about the last question? Just because I also think it's not simply in issues like violence that this is a problem, right? That this contradiction emerges. I'm thinking here of Christian Cooper's response when Amy Cooper was charged with filing a false report, and the reaction he received in social media, right? So he said that was unnecessary. He took essentially on that, at least on that issue, right, an abolitionist position, that it was ridiculous to criminalize her behavior.
Absolutely.
And got attacked, in a lot of social media by a lot of Black voices as being either insufficiently loyal to his own race for failing to do so, or for having a kind of class privilege, right? And it was only out of class privilege that he could imagine not needing this protection from the state against false reports, right? So, the contradictions, right, are throughout our communities. It's not, and including in Black working classes communities, about this tension between are we willing to give up the promise of police protection, even when we know the system is weighted against us, right? And so I just wanted to quickly say that.
No, thanks. That's really a wonderful example to think about, that media event around Amy Cooper and Chris Cooper. The next, I think we have time for one round of questions, and maybe best if we segue it into our final closing comments. And I'm going to start off with questions on policing, because we have plenty on those, but I do want to also go back to thinking about the protests as well. So I might add a few questions about the protests. So there's one question from Trevor Bechtel. I don't have his affiliation here, where he asks that, is abolition the only approach to issues of police violence? And I think this goes back to the question that we'd asked earlier, that there have been various reforms, and those reforms have not worked, but there's been bipartisan support for it. But I think the question is, are there any other ways of thinking about reducing police harm that it currently does in a society without necessarily abolition? And I'm kind of interested in your take on this, because I was very intrigued by the way Ruth Wilson Gilmore talks about this when she talks about non-reformist reforms, where she says, yes, you want to, as an abolitionist, you want to accept whatever reforms are going to immediately put an end to harm. But at the same time, you recognize that the system itself cannot provide a solution. That seems a very pragmatic response. But I'm wondering what you think about that, about this way in which abolition is a distant idea. What happens in between? What are the ways in which you can reduce police harm before then? And a connected question to the question of police is raised by our colleague Ian Shin in the history department, who asks us again to go back to a question that I think Matthew raised about unions, when he says, what does it mean when we think of policing as a labor issue? And I think that is already coming up. Like, what do we do with the power, the clout of police unions? Do we sort of than collective bargaining for the police? Do we disaffiliate the labor movement, like the debate that's happening in the AFL-CIO right now with police unions? But if you are kind of supportive of a labor's right to bargain, what do we do? What can be done to kind of address that question? In the question of protests that I do want us to think about, so there are two questions about police. How does one get step by step to abolition, and the question of what one does with unions as labor. And the question about protests that I wanted to ask, and I think it is the optimist in me that everyone thinks, and I think there are two things that have just completely stunned me and made me really excited to be alive at this moment. And that is the way in which these contemporary protests have really questioned the dominance of the ideology of individualism in the US. So many of you in your work have talked about how this ideology of individualism works to kind of obscure structural causes of inequality, of racism. And all of a sudden, we are now having, which seems like a huge change in this country, at least from my years of being here, we are having this public conversation about social structures, right? So I'm wondering whether from your experience of your work, you would reflect a little about how that ideology of individualism has been so dominant in obscuring these broader questions that we are talking about. And the second kind of really exciting thing about the movement of protest, we've known, Black women have always been very active in histories of Black struggle, the Black freedom struggle, always. But yet there is something very different about this. And here I was reading Barbara Ransby, who really kind of locates this movement, and going back to Matthew's point about Vincent Harding and the river of struggle, she really locates it in a radical Black feminist tradition that goes back to the Combahee River Collective, the Black Radical Congress, critical resistance. And she says it's manifested in two ways. I mean, the kind of intersectional social justice framework that they use, and the kind of democratic horizontal leadership pattern that we see in contemporary movements. And it's really exciting that it is really by centering Black women, Black queer and trans people and their concerns at the center of the movement that we are now seeing the possibility of these protests actually addressing, larger, broader, not larger, but other questions of privileges in society more generally. So this is a very different moment than the kind of discussion we were having some, years back with a sort of conflict between the relative merits of what some people called identity politics versus a sort of universal class struggle. I mean, so Ransby's account of this movement is giving us a way of kind of seeing this Black feminist framing and its prominence in the Black Lives Matter movement more broadly as a way of completely changing the terrain of radical politics, of left politics, what it means to be on the left and progressive in this time. So am I being over optimistic? How is your reading of the protests in this light? So two questions on protests: individualism, Black feminist framing, two questions on police, unions, how do you kind of curb them, what the labor issue is, and then how does one get to abolition in the meantime? What are the alternatives? What are the steps? Yes.
2 minutes each, right?
Slightly more, because we have, 2 minutes each. Sorry, you're right, 2 minutes each.
Okay, I'll start because I find myself feeling optimistic that I'll back up a couple of years. A concept like redlining, I never thought that the academic scholarship we had done about systematic government segregation of the housing market would jump, not just into public discourse, but even journalists began to understand it and start saying it. And the fact that mainstream journalists are using phrases like structural racism, I thought, while I don't agree with the historical analysis of the new Jim Crow, naming it mass incarceration was powerful and meaningful. And in that sense, the way that something like police abolitionism has, through the phrase defunding the police, kind of become more broadly, gives you hope. We have to, as scholars, we don't expect radical change. And so my quick answer, Minnie, is I find myself like hopeful that some things will happen that in 10 years I'll criticize as like reforms that didn't go far enough. But we could imagine taking drugs out of the policing criminalization framework.
Mhm.
We could imagine that men with guns don't need to give out parking and traffic tickets. Like we could imagine most of what police do does not involve crime, and it definitely does not involve violent crime. And we can imagine alternative solutions to violence as well. And so while you have in a political theory sense, you want to go after the whole, enchilada, in terms of policy reforms, I feel there's ways to kind of to make things better, but I am vulnerable to huge critiques because I also think you legalize marijuana and you stop there and you've just reproduced a system of racial privilege, and it's just going to keep on being the same old. So I find myself wanting to be optimistic the older I get, and at the same time feeling like it's very difficult to bring about meaningful change within our political and economic system.
So, do you want to go next? Thank you.
Sure. I'm also optimistic in part because it's the only way to survive sometimes in particularly dark moments. But one thing that I noticed, one public, rhetorical movement or theoretical movement that I noticed, and this goes back to Sophie's question that I tried to answer and realize it moved to the answered category. Sorry, Sophie. You mentioned individualism, Minnie, and one of we won't be able to address the violence of policing or the carceral system until we break down this understanding that the health impacts, and I'll use the word violence, the violence of the policing system can't just be measured by the people who are choked, the people who are killed, or even the number of people who are racially profiled. And we take this lead from, as you said, the Black women, the feminists, the queer studies scholars, and specifically a book that's been influential to me was Andrea Ricci's Invisible No More, in which he talks about all of the impacts of women that we're missing when we're focusing specifically on the pulling of a trigger, right? And this is the shift that I've seen, is we're starting to understand that fragmented families, whether it means at the border or because people are in jail, is an outcome that we need to pay attention to, right? And we see some of our researchers looking at this as well. We looked at large scale mental health among African-American populations after the killing in Ferguson. So we've moved beyond simply thinking about who's on the receiving end of the bullet and thinking about all the people connected to them.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you, Bill. Yeah. Matthew, do you want to?
Sure. No. Well, and thank you, Ann, for all of those answers. Let me say one thing generally, and then one thing specific on the question of the role of Black women in a kind of new forms of leadership in the Black protest tradition. But my general thing, I suppose the answer to my whether I'm optimistic or pessimistic is that I'm kind of flabbergasted by the possibilities. And I think, this is a generational problem, right? That having those of us who came of age in the late 20th century and experienced the right return in American politics, I think we do have a struggle with the imagination of that in fact, this country could be moving in different directions than that, having been the dominant trajectory we all encountered. And in that sense, I think one of the things that makes me really optimistic about the summer is the ways in which the protest movement and its spontaneity and its breadth and width reveals the sort of infrastructure of a radical social movement that exists and that is in place and able to move. I think totally misunderstood by the media, as not only as the media would, but also as it's hard to understand in real time, right? But you don't have those kinds of sustained protests if you don't have that kind of social movement infrastructure. And here particularly, I think of the ways in which the reaction after that first sort of surge of police violence was for more people to go into the streets. And we've seen this again in Portland in the last week. This is a deeply unexpected development, it seems to me. This is, the police understand the history of protest as well, and they understand that when they come out with violence, it goes away, right? That has been the tradition. For it to be met not only with more people, but also with a deeper commitment to nonviolent protest is really extraordinary in its moment and has really transformed so much of this conversation. And I think that's only possible if you have this really well-developed infrastructure of social movement protest that I think has continued to develop in the Trump years after the Women's March and the possibilities there, even as it has had so little influence in actual policy making over the past 3 years. And so that to me is a place of real optimism. Within the Black protest tradition, I think, our Barbara's work and others, and I think we saw this some of the, and obviously in the even the hashtag Black Lives Matter and the women responsible for that, Alicia Garza and others, there's a historically grounded critique of the histories of male hierarchical leadership in the Black protest tradition, and a claiming of this group-centered, going back to Ella Baker, right, to remake Black leadership. And that has been deeply influential in the way Black Lives Matter has been organized, and it's deeply exciting. And as an historian, it's important that to have young people say, "Oh yeah, we read all that stuff and we want to do it differently," is really kind of amazing, right? It's this amazing moment. But I would just remind us that there are those traditions of hierarchical, primarily male-led, whether it's in the church, whether it's in the legal tradition, whether it's in the political tradition, are also there, right? Al Sharpton, Benjamin Crump, all these other folks showing up and announcing themselves in charge in front of something that's already there, right, are also there. So how this leadership dynamic plays out, I think that the window of time is way too short to know.
No,
and
you're
it's
right.
really, really interesting how this Black Lives Matter movement develops and how other and related movements develop around this question of forms of leadership and who gets to determine, right, the set of goals, what's a non-reformist reform, what we're trying to achieve, what the legislative agenda is. All these things are really, I think, up for grabs, at least from my vantage point, and therefore incredibly interesting going forward.
No, I think you're right. Melissa, I'm very sorry, but I have to give you the last word here.
Oh, okay. Very quickly, on the question of reducing police violence, I don't think, sadly, that we really can significantly reduce police violence. Violence and racism are inherent to policing. As a starting point for engaging with those ideas, I would encourage people to watch a short video clip by Dylan Rodriguez, ethnic studies professor, titled "It's Not Police Brutality." You can find it on YouTube. I tried to put this in the chat. And also to read the introduction to historian Nicole Siegel's book, Violence Work, which really explains the role of police as distributors of state violence. And so what I think we need to do instead, how you get to abolition as this larger vision, is to reduce the role of police in society, right? And to shrink their role. Bill was talking about kind of the deep emotional and ideological investment that people have in police, right? And that's because I think on some level, all of us, myself included, love the idea of uniformed people out there ready to save us, right? I mean, I think people want that, and understandably so. And the reason that we want that so much, though, is because there's no one else to call, right? And so we have to start working step by step toward creating systems where, when you're having trouble, when you have a dilemma, that there is someone else to call other than a violence worker.
Wonderful. I want to express my sincere thanks to all of you panelists for this really, really insightful discussion. Thank you to the audience for your questions and your attention. And on behalf of all of us at the Eisenberg Institute, stay healthy, keep safe, and be part of the solution. Thanks.